It shows the opportunity when you have like-minded systems that can connect to each other, planning to operations, to simulations, to AI and digital twins. I'm going to actually rewind back to some of the work we did in 2003 with the U.S. Coast Guard, specifically about how their Coast Guard cutters drive the need for space and facilities, and how do we manage that supply and demand? How do we simulate that? And we actually built a system for them that actually received several awards. But essentially, it's how do you rapidly configure 60 command centers that you typically take almost a year to get design and planning done, to do it in minutes or hours or days instead of months and years. How can we use that to apply it to building information modeling and geographic information systems and digital twins? So we're kind of in the building space, but also very much touching on the entire life cycle and portfolio. And then how do you apply it? This is actually an AI generated image driven from a description output that we had from our data that said, here's a number of seats and workstations and monitors and views of the port that we want to have. So we can quickly kind of simulate that environment and then iterate the design back and forth. We started capturing those drivers of why do we need, what type of data, how many cranes drive the need for space, and then taking those drivers and pushing them to building information modeling. Okay, now we actually need to see a BIM for design and construction. But before we get into design and construction, we need to simulate and do costs and does it fit, and all those kind of questions that come up in the design process. We essentially feed all this data into the database, the Onuma system, and then we could start querying it either manually or with AI. Before, we had to kind of pick things out and feed databases in it, but we're experimenting using these new tools, even ChatGPT, to drive and create building information models from prompts entered into ChatGPT or entered into different inputs. And those inputs are driven from the rules that we talked about earlier. We started pushing data into AI and then asking it questions to output the results to give us a list of spaces that generated the first version of a BIM that could be used for design and construction, and then rapidly configuring it in our application and in Revit and other BIM applications, but essentially pulling that data into BIM and starting to do quick stacking to see, does this fit? Connected to this, we said, okay, what happens if we take the port of the future and move it to Tokyo? The reason we're moving it to Tokyo is we had an exercise with CDV Collectus involved as well a few months ago with the AIA in Japan to plan and design very rapidly waterfront development for housing and mixed use. In other words, this process applies for anything really. It's really information driven from business process modeling into BIM, into GIS, into digital twins, to be able to then drill all the way down to, well, there's my asset of the piece of equipment that's failing. How do we maintain and manage that? All of this data that we showed you then can be used to tell the story. But what we wanted to do was understand the logic behind it so we can get to, okay, we have now port X. In port X, we have buildings that support those cranes, the facility, the asset that have information in them, including early cost and area. And this is the specific space. This is the operations center building. This is each of these blocks represents the equivalent model in the other tool that I showed that is connected systems to systems, digital twins talking to each other as things change. So a lot of different systems talking to each other enable this. And the connectivity that's exciting for me is to be able to tie it back to the why. Why are we building this? We're building this for a specific purpose that was driven from the business process model that drives the need for space, that drives the need for assets, that drives the need for buildings. And all this data is constantly shifting and changing, even for a single port facility, because ports are dynamic, but also for any port facility in the world. You can use this engine now to drive digital twins into anywhere, really. And we're showing ports and port facilities, but it really applies to everything.